Hey everyone, welcome to the Backpacking Light podcast. Today's episode is a Q&A session. It's a wide-ranging exploration of a ton of diverse topics, so stay tuned.
Look for me in the mountains where walking has a way of pulling you to your peace of mind every day.
Hey everybody, my name is Andrew Marshall.
And I'm Ryan Jordan.
And today in the pod, we're going to focus on answering listener questions that were submitted through social media. We're on Instagram and Facebook at Backpacking Light and Twitter at Backpacking. But first, let's do a lockdown check-in. So Ryan, the big question is, how are things going with you in the age of coronavirus?
Well, I have to say I'm kind of glad I'm stuck in a small town in southeast Wyoming because we actually haven't seen too much drama surrounding COVID-19. We have one of the fewest caseloads in Wyoming in the United States. And so we have been on kind of this, stay at home directive for, the same amount of time as the rest of the country. But we're starting to open up a little bit. And impressively, it's proceeding quite cautiously, which feels good, feels like the right thing to do. But it hasn't had a huge impact on our day-to-day life because, as you know, we're a remote company anyway, so we stay at home anyways. And the only real issue has been trying to find trails on the weekends, especially that don't have too many people congregating at them. So our normal day-to-day routines haven't changed too much, but we're taking the normal precautions and trying to stay away from people. And Wyoming has managed to stay under the radar for the most part.
And, we've been talking, you and I, about how people in the backpacking world are using their at-home time in order to further their backpacking goals. Are you doing anything like that right now?
Yeah, I mean, I've stayed close to home. I haven't taken any trips outside of our county by any means, and it's been kind of neat because it's given our family the chance to explore some new trails and new off-trail areas that we would not have normally explored this time of year. So that's been a lot of fun, and I've been taking the time to go out on some quick overnighters and test out a fast packing kit that I'm assembling for 2020 trips, and just got back from a really cool trip to a brand new location that I've never been to before, and yeah, it's been super fun actually. So as long as we're kind of staying under the radar and staying away from people, we're still exploring and enjoying the outdoors.
Yeah, I'm doing something similar, even though we live in a tourist town. People either come here for the lake or to ski, which leaves the trails mostly to locals. And I'm fortunate enough that our house backs up to the national forest. And so I have access to a pretty wide-ranging network of trails that are very underutilized. So what I've been doing is actually working towards a goal I've had for a long time, which is doing a marathon.
Oh, nice.
And so I'm up to 20 miles now on my trail runs. I can knock out 15 miles fairly easily. And my 20 miler last week, I think I climbed like over 3,000 feet worth of elevation. So it's a pretty intense process, and it's taking a lot of time. So I'm grateful that I have the space that I can do that safely without endangering anyone else.
Yeah, it's nice having the time that isn't sucked up by everything else that comes with day-to-day living in a consumerist society. So it's great that you've kind of latched on to a new project and are taking the time to train. That's really gratifying.
It is, but it certainly gives me appreciation for long distance athletes like ultra runners and things like that. It's such a time consuming training schedule. Actually, even with extra COVID time, I've had trouble figuring out like, okay, how am I going to get a 3.5 hour training run in today? It's a lot.
Yeah, it's very challenging. I've been through cycles like that as well, and it's a difficult balance for sure. Okay, let's take a minute and chat about gear. What new gear have you been using or testing lately, Andrew?
Well, this kind of ties into what I was just saying. when my runs started to get longer, especially where I'm running on trails and back in the mountains and stuff, I wanted to start carrying a hydration pack, but I also wanted something that was going to be big enough that I could go out on maybe a trail running overnight. This is kind of the idea I have as I work up towards ultras, that I want to, like, say, run out 30 miles, camp overnight, and then run home. So I reached out to Jeff Garmeyer, friend of the show. Many of our listeners will know who that is. And he recommended the Ultimate Direction FKT hydration vest. This is the vest he was going to wear on his attempt at the Barkley Marathons. It's 18 liters of space. It's got 8 external pockets. See, I'm looking at the specs right now. It's about 12 ounces, and it's been a good pack so far.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see the hybridization of running packs to, I don't know, it's just crossover to fast packing, I guess. And I've used running packs quite a bit. And my current fast packing pack is an Atom Packs that has a running vest harness. So similar to what you see on the FKT pack from Ultimate Direction. But the hybridization of these two designs is, to me, really cool. And I never really understood the value of a running vest harness until I started experimenting with this on backpacking trips and running with a pack, and then really kind of cranking down all the straps on these harnesses so the pack stayed stable against your back has given me brand new insight about how to move fast in the mountains. So it's a really cool thing to explore.
Yeah, that was kind of a learning curve for me, because I started out, I'd never worn a hydration vest before of any type, and I started out cranking the straps down and then running uphill, and I was essentially like suffocating myself. I couldn't,
Yeah,
I couldn't
right.
breathe. It took me a while to figure out how to loosen them up on the go and then tighten them up for the downhills.
Very good. Well, anything else?
Yeah, the other thing that I've been looking at lately is the BioLite Headlamp 200. I wrote a review of this a couple of weeks ago, and this is a rechargeable headlamp. And as I said in my review, it's not the most powerful rechargeable headlamp. It's not the lightest rechargeable headlamp, but it might be the most comfortable rechargeable headlamp. And a lot of this comes from, it's got an ergonomic sort of curve to it, so it sits really nice on your forehead. And the strap is also one piece of die-cut Lycra, so it's very comfortable. There's no seams or stitching that can cause any rubbing or chafing while it's on your head.
Yeah, I have one myself, and this is the primary selling point of the headlamp is, insane comfort. But I never really noticed it through the winter because I always had the headlamp on with a hat. But then this spring, for the first time, I used it on my bare head, and then I noticed a substantial difference between this and the other headlamps I'd been using. So I concur that if you have to have a headlamp against your bare head, this is worth looking at.
Yep. So yesterday you posted a video on social media of your unboxing of this Goose Feet custom sweater zip jacket thing, and boy, was I jealous.
Yeah, I got a lot of feedback from it, and I woke up this morning to quite a number of emails in my inbox asking me for specs and how to get one of these. It's an experiment for sure. I worked with Ben Smith at Goose Feet Gear, and I told him that I am assembling this fast packing kit. And most of the down gear I have is too much for summer and too heavy. And admittedly, I don't hike as much in the summer as I do the rest of the year. And part of that is because summer is a busy season for backpacking light, and I don't have as much time in the summers. But looking at assembling a clothing system for mild conditions, mild temperatures, fair weather, I realized that most of my down gear was just kind of overkill. And I have a couple of synthetics that I take during the summer, like the Patagonia Micro Puff and the Enlightened Equipment Torrid Apex. But even those items are a little bit too bulky to fit into my 30-liter fast packing pack, which I'm really trying to focus on reducing bulk again, so I can move fast with a really stable load. So I started shopping around for down sweaters, and most of them were, they're as heavy as my synthetic stuff. And so I contacted Ben and said, hey, what do you think about this? Can we really make a super light down sweater that still has enough loft to cut the chill when the temperatures get down around freezing? And so we came up with this pullover design, put a 2-inch collar on it, added some overfill down, lengthened the hem a little bit so it actually dropped below the waist. A lot of these ultralight down sweaters out there are really short. And then put a kangaroo pocket in for insulating your hands. And the result was a jacket that weighs less than 6 ounces and is really pretty warm for its weight. So it's got, an inch of loft and 950 fill power down and 8D fabric. So we used as materials that were as light as possible to achieve maximum warmth to weight ratio. And it's a pretty sweet piece. I'm looking forward to using it and reviewing it.
And it's got a quarter zip, right? So you're also saving weight because you don't have a zipper all the way down?
No, it doesn't have a quarter zip. It's got a zipper that's actually longer than a half zip. And I wanted a deeper neck zipper in a pullover style for 2 reasons. One, I didn't want, if I had to wear this while wearing a pack, I did not want the hip belt to cross a zipper because that has always been a chafe spot for me, a real irritant. And the other issue is I wanted to be able to get the jacket on and off easily. So a deeper zipper helps with that without, dislocating the shoulder. And then the third reason is for ventilation, to give me the ability to wear the jacket, unzip it completely so I'm comfortable in warmer conditions.
The other thing you've been looking at is the Helly Hansen Odin Ultralight 2.0 rain jacket. And you told me you were very impressed by this.
Oh man, every time a rain jacket comes across my desk, I kind of groan anymore. And they all seem to be some iteration of the same collection of fabrics and design and fit, and they all seem to weigh, 8 to 12 ounces. So the jacket I've been using as my core jacket has been the Arc'teryx Zeta FL, which I wrote a review on a while back. So that's kind of my gold standard for 2.5 layer waterproof breathable rain jackets right now. And I have to admit that of the dozen or so jackets that have been sent for review to me, comparing them to that Arc'teryx jacket is kind of a lost cause. That Arc'teryx jacket is really, really well done. So then I got this Odin from Helly Hansen, and Helly Hansen is not the brand I think of when I think of ultralight backpacking. But the Odin, the moment I put it on, I realized 2 really interesting things about it. Number one, it's incredibly light. It's less than 6 ounces. It is a terrific fit. I mean, these guys have dialed in the patterning to the point where this is probably one of the top 3 fitting rain jackets I've ever put on. So there's the Arc'teryx. I have an ultralight Patagonia jacket, and then this Helly Hansen Odin. And the fit and articulation, the construction quality, and the breathability of this particular fabric are all outstanding. So Helly Hansen has kind of quietly moved into this space and created a jacket that I think is terrific. So I haven't had it out for long-term use. You and I have talked about this. We're going to send it out to a reviewer and then we'll see what happens. But based on our first looks at it, it's really a well-done piece of gear.
Awesome. I can't wait to see what our author thinks about it. All right, so let's move on to our questions. As we said, we solicited these questions on social media, so we've got quite a wide variety of things to go through here. The first question is tips for getting a good night's rest as a side sleeper. So this person, Sean, asks, in all my backpacking adventures, I've only slept through the night once and only because of pure exhaustion. I use a quilt and an air pad and a custom-made memory foam pillow. I've gone through my share of pads. The best night's sleep was on a Big Agnes double comfort, but it developed a hole that he could never repair, and it was heavy and non-insulated. So it sounds like Sean has tried a few different combinations of air pads and pillows, and he still can't get a good night's sleep.
I hear you, Sean. I have suffered back pain for going on 2 decades now, and I paid less attention to my sleeping pad, and I always try to dial this in with my pillow. and I'm a side sleeper, and I flip from side to side throughout the night. And so I've tried literally dozens of different pillows. I wrote the ultralight pillow guide, gear guide at Backpacking Light, and I finally settled on something that I wanted the ability to be able to adjust the thickness of the pillow without adjusting the compressibility, which you cannot do in an air pillow. So I've gone to the Hyperlight Mountain Gear stuff sack pillow, which has a nice fleecy surface on one side. And I put some recycled open cell foam in it, which I procured from my local UPS store. And I use a Z-Rest style sit pad. And so I will put that in the bottom. That gives me a little bit of height without compressibility. And then I will add a wind shirt or rain jacket or a really light puffy inside the pillow stuff sack to adjust the overall comfort. Now, having said that, it still wasn't enough. I had to go through sleeping pads to test them. And I finally settled on a Nemo Tensor regular wide pad. The trick for me was going to a wide pad, and it helped for a couple reasons. When I was on my back, it allowed me to keep my arms on the pad, because when my arms fell off the pad, I tended to get some upper back and neck pain. The other issue is when I slept on my stomach, I could adjust my legs and keep my whole body on the pad, and I didn't fall off. And that had a huge impact on side sleeping for me. So those two changes for me completely changed the game of how I sleep comfortably in the backcountry. And honestly, I would rather sleep on this pad and my pillow than I would on my bed at home.
Wow, that's quite a statement. Sean, I also feel you. I've also essentially never gotten a good night's sleep in the backcountry, even after, over a thousand nights out there. Honestly, the best night I've ever had is in a hammock, and I'm a side sleeper and a rotator as well. So we'll be answering some hammock related questions later on. So hang in there for that, Sean.
So do you sleep on your side in a hammock, or do you find yourself that you're comfortable on your back?
Both. I kind of rotisserie through the night. The only way I've found I can't sleep in a hammock is on my stomach.
Interested, yeah.
Yeah, but I know a stomach sleeper who also sleeps on a stomach in a hammock, and he loves it.
Oh my, that would bend my body into
Yeah,
shapes I wouldn't be comfortable
I don't
with.
understand it. I don't understand it.
Okay, our next question comes from Rigby, and he asks, is there a minimum thickness of a ClimaShield Apex layer over a down quilt to absorb the body perspiration that passes through the feathers? Would 2 ounce per square yard or less do the trick?
I mean, my thought is that it's really just all about moving that dew point to the outer layer, and so how thick that outer layer isn't really important. I mean, it seems like as thin as possible would be good. Ryan, I know you use this system quite a bit for winter camping. What do you think?
As long as you're not camping in extraordinarily polar cold conditions, and by this I'm talking 20 degrees below zero or more, in which case you're going to need a thicker layer. You can kind of solve this equation and graph the dew point location. And for most temperate climates that we're backpacking in, that dew point is going to occur within a 1/4 inch of the outside shell of the outer bag. So a 2.5 ounce Apex insulation, that's the weight that's commonly available at make your own gear suppliers. That is about 0.6 inches thick. So that is plenty to keep that dew point in the synthetic layer. So that's what I use personally, is the 2.5 ounce. And it allows me to make an overquilt that weighs, in the range of 10 or 11 ounces.
Okay, our next question is about battery power. The question is, What's the optimal amount of battery bank MAH that is ideal for a 3-day light backpacking trip? Our listener will be using GPS on his phone. His base weight is 12.5 pounds. He doesn't have a solar charger or any way to recharge his battery banks. And he asks, do you recommend having 2 separate battery banks with a total MAH, or one primary, one backup in case one gets lost or malfunctions, or just one large bank? Thanks.
Okay, let's define MAH. MAH is milliamp hours, and it defines the power inside a battery bank. So if you have a phone, for example, that has a 1000 milliamp hour battery in it, and you have a battery bank that has a 1000 milliamp hour capacity to it, that means you can charge your phone once. Now, it's not exactly a 1-to-1 ratio because there's a loss of efficiency and there's some temperature effects and things like that. But that's how you can give a good estimate for how much power you need, for example, to charge your phone X number of times.
Right. And that being said, I think that having 2 different battery banks would be overkill for a 3-day trip. If you've got a battery bank that you know is functional and you've tested it out before, I have no qualms about taking just one battery bank with the total amount of MAH that you'll need, as opposed to taking 2 and using one as a backup, because I think that having 2 with a cumulative amount of MAH would weigh a lot more than just having one with that same amount of MAH.
Yeah, because if you take 2 battery banks, you're not only taking the battery capacity and the weight of that, you're taking the weights of the housing and the metal that goes into making the battery bank. So that it's definitely going to be a loss of efficiency there. And I guess my question is, what is the consequence of your battery bank failing? And what is the incidence of your battery bank failing? I use almost exclusively Anker power banks, ANKER. They have been rock solid reliable for me in almost all conditions, and I've never had one fail. That's not to say that nobody's never had an Anker bank fail, because there have been a few failures, but I believe, based on my reviews, that the incidence of failure of this particular brand is low. I'm sure there are other reliable brands out there as well, so this isn't to say that Anker's the best one. But again, let's go back to the question, what happens if the battery bank fails? Is that going to cause a lot of drama for you? Now, for me, if I'm shooting video and photos on my phone for personal reasons, and that's the main reason I want a battery bank, it's not going to be a big deal if my battery bank fails. If I'm using my phone for GPS and it fails, that has the potential to be a bigger deal. But at the same time, I'm usually carrying a paper map as a backup and to write notes on and things like that. If you're using a satellite communicator like an inReach, and that communications is absolutely critical for maintaining safety between you and your family, or you need that backup to, you feel like you're really hanging it out on a difficult trip in a remote location and you absolutely need that SOS capability, then you might consider an alternative solution as a backup. In that case, I would bring along your primary battery bank, and then maybe just include a small cigar style battery that's as small and as light as possible as your emergency backup. So for me, for an overnighter, I basically take one tiny cigar shaped battery that gives me enough power for one full recharge of my phone. I use an iPhone XS, which has a 2,650 milliamp battery. And the battery charger that I bring for an overnighter is an Anker PowerCore Mini that provides 3,350 milliamps of juice and weighs about 3 ounces. So for longer trips where I need to recharge my phone, my inReach, my Phoenix watch, my headlamp, I may bring a battery bank with up to, let's say, 25 or 30,000 milliamps of storage. And that's going to weigh a little over a pound by the time you add all the necessary cables. Okay. The next question comes from Will, and he asks, I'm curious about your opinion on hammock systems. Obviously not the best for high winds, but what are your thoughts?
So, Will, I've just started getting into hammock systems, and I've written a couple of pieces on the website about this. As I said at the top of the show, I'm finding them incredibly useful in improving my quality of sleep and therefore my quality of life on the trail. Now, that being said, I've already invested fairly heavily in ground shelters and the associated gear. And when I started getting into hammocks, I wasn't looking to spend the time and money assembling a hammock system piecemeal, which you can do, at least not yet. But there's some great entry level all in one hammock systems out there that I think are worth taking a look at and are fairly budget friendly. One is the Hammock Mantis UL, which I used and wrote a review of. And another one that some commenters in our forums really like is the Hennessy Hammocks all in one setup. REI also has an all in one hammock setup that's no longer widely available, but that might mean you can get it at a reasonable price. Ryan, you're not really a hammock user, right?
So back in the early 2000s, I experimented with hammocks quite a bit with what was on the market then. And that was primarily the Hennessy hammocks and then a couple of these crossovers that were made by folks who were targeting bushcrafters and kind of military style campers versus ultralight backpackers. But I owned and used a Hennessy ASIM ultralight for many years, and I had some really positive experiences in it. I spend most of my time above the tree line, and so I find a hammock less useful to me on a routine basis for my own backpacking trips. But at the same time, the experience I had with the Hennessy ASIM was really positive, and I slept super comfortably. Now, I asked you a question before earlier in the podcast about side sleeping versus back sleeping on the hammock, and I've always been a side sleeper. And one of the things I noticed with sleeping in the Hennessy ASIM is that I defaulted to my back and slept great. I never slept on my side. I never slept on my stomach. And when I'm sleeping on the ground or in a bed, I'll flip between all three positions. So that was kind of eye-opening to me. And I did feel that once I dialed in the angles of pitching the hammock and things like that, I found them to be quite comfortable. The other issue is that because I spend most of my time backpacking in the winter and cold environments and snowy places, I haven't been able to sort out a hammock system that is warm enough that's going to compete with my existing 2-pound winter tent. So there's lots of moving pieces with hammocks, like under quilts, and lots of things you can do. And then you've got, wind and blizzards and things like this. So I've always just kind of defaulted towards tents.
Yeah, and I think that's ultimately why I haven't invested heavily in like getting maybe like a DCF tarp for my hammock or something, because like most people, I've got a certain budget for gear and I've got a certain space for gear, and you can't take a hammock everywhere just because of the nature of the gear. So it's not a multifunctional piece of gear in the same way that a ground shelter is.
Right, right. All right, Doug writes, what are your recommendations on solar panels?
So, Doug, I've tried a solar panel one time on a through hike of the Colorado Trail, and ultimately, personally speaking, I think I'd rather just use rechargeable battery banks. I ended up finding the solar panels to be very fiddly. They've got long charging times, way longer than you'd expect, unless you happen to already know something about how solar power works. There's unreliable weather to deal with. Even when you're above tree line or in sunny areas, you may not get the weather conditions that will actually charge your panel and your battery. And they can be heavy and awkward. So personally, I don't recommend them for anything other than expedition style trips with extremely limited opportunities to recharge. But that being said, Ryan, what are your recommendations on solar panels?
Well, you can use mathematics to work out whether or not a solar panel versus a battery bank is going to be weight efficient for you. So even in optimum conditions and using the very lightest, most expensive solar panels on the market, solar doesn't even become a consideration unless you're out for at least 2 or 3 weeks without resupply. And that assumes you're charging, say, a phone, a headlamp, and a satellite messenger. So the benefit of a solar panel for most of us on short trips in a temperate climate where you don't have an endless amount of sun is going to be extremely low relative to battery banks that are on the market, which are very, very efficient for their weight and can really pack a lot of power into a small light package.
Ian has a question about the best rechargeable batteries in the AA and AAA categories, and I don't really know much about this.
I have studied this a lot, and I used to use AA and AAA batteries in my cameras and GPS units and headlamps. And so I had the chance to really kind of dive in and take a look at the various rechargeable options. The Panasonic Eneloop has always kind of been the gold standard in this area. It's a really good, reliable, high quality battery. And when it came on the market about, oh gosh, it's probably been 5 to 8 years ago, it was the market leader by a long shot. But now the area of rechargeable batteries has become so commoditized that we've seen manufacturing consolidate into just a few major factories that are located in China, Japan, and South Korea. And so these factories are now producing similar technology and rechargeables for a whole bunch of different brands. And so we're starting to see the performance of these batteries converge in the past few years. And so if you look at the three notable brands in this area, which include Eneloop and Energizer, which are the two biggest, and then this little one called Amazon Basics. And so this is where Amazon goes in and takes an existing technology and rebrands it with their brand. I don't know exactly where Amazon is getting their batteries, but the performance of those batteries specifically has been really, really good. But I've had good success with all three of these brands. Now, there's been some chit chat in the ultralight community about the higher power density that comes from EBL brand batteries, but I've tried them. They've been very unreliable in cold environments, and I don't think what is on paper translates well to in the field, especially in cold environments. So I tend to just use Eneloop. That's what I've always used. But I would keep your eye on the Amazon brand because those batteries seem to have very positive reviews about them.
Are headlamps the only thing that you're using this type of battery for now?
No, I'm actually using a rechargeable headlamp now. Both my ultralight headlamp that I use for task lighting and my night hiking headlamp have rechargeable batteries in them, but not AA or AAA.
Right. Yeah, I was just wondering, like, what, I think that's probably the last category out of all the things you mentioned that even mostly headlamps are still AA and AAA, right?
Yeah. All the Petzls that are non-rechargeable are mostly AAA, and I think you can look at some of the specialized Phoenix headlamps and Nightcore, and some of those use a single AA battery in them and very, very powerful headlamps. But I don't think I'm carrying any device at all anymore, including camera gear, or audio gear, or anything that has AA or AAA batteries in them.
Yeah. Well, our next question just says 6 Moon Design Lunar Solo ?
So we just published a review on that, and we'll link it in the show notes for you. I don't know what the user was asking about this tent, but I will say this: this is a tent that is iconic in the ultralight backpacking community, and it's been around for 2 decades now. It's amazing the longevity of this design. It has evolved through the years, different fabrics, different places of manufacture, things like that. And we communicated this in our review, but the primary market for this tent is going to be larger folks, so taller people who want more interior volume. It's got a good peak height, it's long, it's wide, but there's so much fabric in this tent that it's, because of its interior volume, is pretty big, and it's only supported by one pole. So it's not a great choice for severely inclement windy weather or where you need some resistance to snow loading. But at $200, it's one of the most economical options on the market, and that's really where its target market is.
Okay, I want to toss these next 2 questions just directly to you, Ryan, because they're really in your wheelhouse here. The first is thoughts on DCF event mid shelters, especially as compared to standard DCF?
This fabric construct where you have Dyneema composite fabrics, which is a non-woven high tear strength sandwich of mylar and ultra high molecular weight polyethylene fibers, and an event or some other type of waterproof breathable membrane, is not well tested for longevity. So we see that DCF WPB, as the manufacturer calls it, these panels are used in the ends of the Hyperlight Mountain Gear Dirigo tent. It's used in the canopy of the Locust Gear Jedi tent. And my experience in both of those tents are that this fabric is very breathable. It's not a magic bullet when it comes to condensation. You can put as breathable of a fabric as you want in a tent, but if the interior vapor pressure differential between the inside of the tent and the outside of the tent is low enough, you're going to get condensation, and that always occurs at lower temperatures and higher humidities. So you can never escape the conditions that are going to form condensation. So what these fabrics give you is a higher buffer of dryness across a wider range of temperatures and humidities. That said, DCF Event is an incredibly effective fabric in a tent with that respect. The challenge with this fabric is we just don't have a feel for longevity of, how durable they are, how abrasion resistant they are, and they are fragile. I mean, this is a mylar membrane that is easily punctured, so you have to be cautious about where you're setting up your tent and how you're inserting the poles into the tent and things like this. So again, I think it's a great technology to explore, but it is definitely in the realm of innovation when it comes to product life cycle. So we are not ready to say that this thing's ready for prime time and can be used across everybody's designs
And everybody's budget, right?
That's very expensive fabric, and that will always be the limitation to this one, because it's just difficult to make. I mean, you're looking at a fabric that's $35 to $50 per square yard, so it's extraordinarily expensive.
So the next question is, what are the highest winds realistically for a mid-style tarp like the Locust Gear Khufu or the Mountain Laurel Designs Duo Mid in a variety of conditions?
Okay, so let's assume we're looking at a cell nylon version of the tarp, and that you have super robust tent stakes, because the failure point of any ultralight tent that has a reasonable amount of tension on the stakes is going to be the tent stake pulling out. So in severely inclement weather, assuming I'm on soil and not snow, I'm going to have 8-inch MSR ground hog stakes, which are a Y-channel stake, and those are going to be placed at my highest tension corners of the tent so that I can crank down at least 15, 20, maybe even in severe storms, 25 pounds of force on those stakes. So assume that you have the stakes, you have all the guidelines guide out that you need, and you're looking at a sil nylon tarp that gives you lots of stretch. You should be able to be just fine in a 50-mile-an-hour wind gust in a tent like this, especially the Khufu or the Duo Mid, which have a fairly low peak height. Once you get into a peak height of higher than about 4 feet, now you're starting to dip into this higher layer where higher winds occur, and your tent is going to be less stable. And the reason for that is because if you look at laminar wind speed across the ground, that wind speed increases significantly at about 3 feet above the ground. Now, of course, it depends on the roughness of the ground surface and things like that. But up above about 3 feet, you start getting much more powerful winds. And so any shelter that's going to have a height of greater than 3 feet, that taller height is going to be subject to higher forces. But my experience has been 50-mile-an-hour gusts are no problem, but That's with a caveat. You've got to have a solid stakeout point, and the guidelines need to be set.
Now, just for the sake of a thought experiment, you made a point of saying, assuming that they have the sil nylon version of these tarps. So how does everything you just said change if you have a less stretchy material like DCF?
Yeah, the ability to take a sil nylon tent and put 20 pounds of force on a guy line, the sil nylon responds very well to that, and because of its stretch. And so you can create a pretty stable structure. With DCF, it's going to depend on the manufacturer's ability to properly cut and sew a DCF shelter. You don't have as much stretch. So if you start pulling 20 or 25 pounds of force onto the corner of a DCF pyramid, you have to make sure that that shelter is precisely built. Otherwise, you're going to end up causing areas of strain and DCF seams or side panels if they're not cut precisely, and that can create some issues. So my Locust Gear Kufu is absolutely perfect in its construction quality and precision, and I can easily do that. I have had reports of people who've used DCF shelters from Mountain Laurel Designs that similar forces can be levied out on those shelters, but it's not consistent across all brands. So these two brands in particular, I think you're fine, but it's just something to be aware of because DCF requires so much more precision to manufacture. Okay, next question is, I am currently planning to hike the AT next year. I was wondering if you could give me some advice as to planning. Not really sure how to go about it. I've done quite a bit of research on a few books that may be beneficial. First is the AWOL. Not sure if this is the best book out to use as a foundation for things such as town visits, resupplying, and whatnot, or if there is a better book that I should bring. I have not through hiked the AT. I've done some section hikes down there. I can't speak to any data books or anything like that because I didn't use them. So Andrew, I'll have to defer to you on this one.
So I'll start off by caveat that I through hiked in 2012. And like any good through hiker, I have my grumbles about how trail culture has changed since then. But so when I hiked in 2012, the AWOL, which we'll just say is officially called the AT Guide, it's compiled by a former through hiker named AWOL. Everyone just calls it the AWOL. It's a data book, and it was the gold standard. There are one or two other data books that you could find at the time, but everybody that I knew had the AWOL. I found this book to be very well updated and useful for town visits. There's a map of every trail town in the book, along with detailed descriptions of the services, phone numbers, operating hours. In advance of this podcast, I did check to make sure that AWOL is still updating it, and it seems like his operation has only gotten bigger and more streamlined, and I know his website's better than it was in 2012. So it seems like that's still the way to go. And it even looks like in order to maybe compete with Guthook and things like that, he's got an interactive PDF version that you can put on your phone. And of course, the data book itself also comes in unbound versions, so you can send yourself the book in sections if you want to. Now, all that being said, I through hiked before Guthook, which is kind of like the gold standard through hiking app, was so ubiquitous. I have no idea if Guthook is any good for town visits or if it's mostly just a tool to figure out where you are on the trail. I've only used Guthook once for the Tahoe Rim Trail, and I didn't have to resupply for that trip. In terms of general planning, if you aren't going to mail yourself all your food, in other words, if you're planning on doing the bulk of your resupply from stores in town, my advice would be to plan loosely, but don't get too obsessed with planning out every day or every resupply point. You're talking about a journey that could last between 3 and 6 months. There's just no way that you're going to be able to plan that out day by day unless you're an extremely accomplished, already experienced through hiker. And even then, I don't even know why you would. Life is fluid on the trail, especially the Appalachian Trail, and you might end up walking faster or slower than you think you will, hooking up with a trail family, or There's just 1,000 things that could change your plans. As far as gear goes, a lot of people pay attention to the so-called big three, the pack, shelter, and sleep system. And I think that's absolutely tried and true. But I think that strategy can be adjusted a little bit based on your hiking style. So lately, my style has been to spend big days on trail and minimal time in camp. So I'm much more focused on my clothing and footwear now. And those are the things that I'm going to spend time iterating and really getting dialed in. So I think it really makes a difference to focus on being comfortable with whatever your primary activity is. So that's a lot, but hopefully that's helpful. So next question is cell phone, worn weight or carried weight?
So someone asked this on Instagram, and my response, which was kind of tongue in cheek, is if you are sharing your gear list on the internet, then include it in your worn weight so that the internet can see that your base weight is actually lighter. But if not, include it in carried weight. And I mean that a little bit cheeky because I don't know that it matters as much as we think it does. When I think of pack weight, I think of all the gear that I'm taking, and in my own personal spreadsheets, I don't delineate base weight from worn weight from carried weight. I do delineate pack weight from consumables because I'd like to see, what my potential minimum pack weight is going to be as I go. But throughout the course of a long trip, especially, I'm shifting so much stuff around between the outside pockets of my pack and my clothing and my pockets and things like this. I think it's an academic exercise that probably doesn't mean a whole lot. Now there's a suggestion out there that the actual weight in the backpack is what matters, because if you put stuff in your pockets, it doesn't strain your body as much. But again, I think I've tried to work out the math on this, and these are academic exercises that you're not going to save a bunch of energy by putting a bunch of stuff in your pockets. And I just don't know how valuable that exercise is. Go ahead. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it gets at what our next question is, which is what is a totally realistic base weight to aim for? The internet is like a competition in terms of base weight. And I really want to focus in on that last part because it's like, hey, so the point of ultralight backpacking is to impress people on Reddit, right? Like it can sometimes feel that way. I've got a good friend, old hiking buddy, who went down what he calls the ultralight rabbit hole and got his base weight down to something just like ridiculous, just like 6.5 pounds or something like that. But he wasn't comfortable. He wasn't having any fun out there. He was just miserable and just moving as fast as he could for no reason. And I think it just goes back to something that we talk a lot about, which is what is the point of ultralight?
Yeah, that's really good. And we'll link to an essay I wrote last year about this topic that generated quite a lot of discussion at BPL. And it was asking the question, how do we talk about ultralight? And so for me, if you're looking for a number that you want to shoot for, it's going to be a very practical number. And I'm just going to say 10 pounds. Now, for you, it could be 12, it could be 15. And that's assuming that's the weight of all your gear, not your food and water, but all your gear, including the clothing that you wear and whatever stuff you want to hide in your pockets. But at 10 pounds, you should be able to get to this weight of equipment and take a summer hike in a temperate, mild climate environment and enjoy yourself and be comfortable. That's the state of where gear is today. And you shouldn't have to spend an extraordinary amount of money. Now, if you're looking at taking that 10-pound equipment allocation and going off into the fringe seasons, spring and fall, or high mountain environments where the weather can be a little more iffy, then you will probably have to spend more money to achieve that particular weight. So when I'm coaching people who are coming from a traditional backpacking background where they're carrying heavy traditional gear, typically the weight of their equipment And again, when I say weight, I'm talking about everything from shoes to trekking poles to clothing worn, and then everything you carry in your pack. They're looking at about 30 down to somewhere maybe 22 to 25 pounds. So chopping that in half is a very realistic goal for summer backpacking. And so I would spend less time focusing on a number to achieve and look at the direction you're making. And Andrew mentioned going down the ultralight rabbit hole. We've all done this. So this process of lightening up is often lightening up to the point where you start to experience discomfort, and then backing off a little bit and adding a few things back to your kit that add more comfort, more safety, more enjoyment for you.
Okay, the next question is, what are your thoughts on the effectiveness and longevity of treated down in sleeping bags? This is a great question.
Yeah, this is a really good question. First, treated down is not a miracle cure. It does not replace your intelligence when it comes to keeping your down sleeping bag dry. So it doesn't mean you can go outside and spend the night in a rainstorm in a treated down bag, or on a multi-day trip, you don't have to worry about condensation management anymore. And the reason is that moisture still gets into your sleeping bag the same way it does with a non-treated down bag. And then you're taking that bag, you're stuffing it in a stuff sack, and the pressure that results from stuffing it in the stuff sack is enough to wet the feathers of your down bag, even with treated down. So keep that in mind. That's not going to solve the issue of keeping your bag dry when you stuff it in your stuff sack. The second thing is that the longevity of this treatment is still unknown. Now, manufacturers have put their down bags through 50 wash cycles and said, hey, this stuff lasts 50 wash cycles. And we interpret that to mean that, oh, let's see, 50 wash cycles, that's 50 years of use for me. It's just, it doesn't work like that. You have to look at stuff cycles. You have to look at the contamination of the bag from your body oils or external dirt. And there's a lot that goes into down bag wear. So what we do know with treated down is that while your down is lofted, if a water drop comes into contact with a down feather, it's less likely to penetrate that down feather. Now, how practical is that for backpacking use? I think the extension is somewhat limited. The one thing that is important to note is that when you treat down, you reduce the fill power in terms of fill volume per ounce versus untreated feathers, because you're adding a treatment to the down that collapses the feather, the plumule, just a little bit. Now, it's not much. It's 10% to 25%, depending on the nature of the treatment, but it does reduce it just enough to not make this type of down the most weight efficient down to use. I don't personally see the compelling benefit of using treated down in the context where you're backpacking on multi-day trips and potentially stuffing wet down over and over again. So yeah, I think it's a great idea. I just don't know that it's been executed to the point that makes it worth the additional cost and weight and things like that.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that, companies like Feathered Friends don't use treated down at all in their bags.
Yeah, I don't think Western Mountaineering is either.
Mm-hmm. We have a very lucky listener here whose first backpacking trip ever is going to be the John Muir Trail starting August 20th. First of all, I hope that your permit doesn't get canceled with COVID. That would be heartbreaking. But anyway, assuming that it goes through, he says he's not at ultralight yet. And what about the ULA Catalyst as a pack?
I think the Catalyst is probably one of the best designed through hiking backpacks I've ever seen. It has the capability to haul a good, heavy, large load when you have to resupply. The Mariposa has the volume, but I don't know that it has the frame chops to be able to comfortably carry heavier loads. And by heavier loads, I mean something greater than 30 pounds, which is what you'll typically be carrying at the beginning of a resupply.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is the difference is the Mariposa has a much softer frame. And so you put 30 pounds into that pack, and all of a sudden you're collapsing that frame by several inches and putting more strain on your shoulders.
All right. The next question is, oh, this is such a great question. Is there a scientific basis for zero drop shoes? Now, but before I toss to you, Ryan, I have anecdotal evidence for zero drop shoes, which is that when I wear regular shoes to trail run, let's say trail runners with anywhere between a 4 millimeter to an 8 millimeter drop, my knees hurt. My knees hurt because when I first started backpacking, I was overweight and I did a lot of damage to my knees hiking thousands of miles with extra body weight. When I wear zero drop shoes, my calves hurt. And I'd much rather my calves hurt because they are muscle and they can repair themselves, unlike my knees. So now, Ryan, scientific data am I just fooling myself, or is there something to this?
I think there's something to it. And here's what I think is happening. With a heel strike, especially the faster you move, the heavier your pack weight, the heavier your body weight. When you hit the ground with your heel, there's an immediate rapid loading of that heel as your body weight slams into the ground. And it's a two-phase process. So once the heel strikes the ground, there's this really quick dynamic load as the ground pushes back. And then what happens as you roll forward into your stride, the rest of your body weight comes down, body and pack weight comes down and creates this secondary loading. And that secondary loading is absorbed by your body's musculature, like your calves and your Achilles and the rest of your spinal chain. But at that first heel strike, that's being absorbed by joints. That's the joints of your lower body. So that's your heel, your knee, and a little bit in your hip. And scientists have measured this, and it's really significant. So when you go to a zero drop shoe and a flat-footed strike, that initial loading is less. Interestingly, that secondary loading where your body now comes into resistance with the ground surface, that resistance is often more. So that means you're going to create more stress on your musculature, your calves, your Achilles, and your thighs or your hamstrings. So it's a trade-off. And it has to do with how much force you're putting on your joints versus how much force you're going to put on your musculature, your soft tissues. And so for me personally, I've always felt better putting that force on my soft tissues, because when I switched to a low drop shoe, my back pain from hiking decreased. And so there's my anecdotal evidence, and the science seems to support that. What the science doesn't support, and where there's a lot of controversy still about this, is that it's a more energy efficient way to hike. And I think the differences are very small, and I don't think those are probably the primary advantages of using a zero drop shoe.
Right.
Okay. Our final question, it's kind of a fun one. What are your favorite hiking books and movies?
All right, I'll start off here. I may have talked about this book maybe once on the podcast a long time ago, but my recent favorite hiking book is called On Trails, an Exploration, and this is by a journalist named Robert Muir. And this book is kind of a natural history of trails, why and how they're formed and how they're made by both humans and animals. And it's a fascinating read, and to me, it's the best kind of nonfiction book, because it takes something that's very complicated and scientific and makes it engaging and readable for a general audience. Of course, I grew up reading A Walk in the Woods by Bill Bryson. People either love that book or they hate it, but I'm a big Bill Bryson fan, again, because of the craft that he brings to nonfiction storytelling. And as a writer myself, Bryson's style has been a big blueprint in my own travel and outdoor writing in the last few years. And the final thing, this is going to sound weird, but I really enjoyed reading The Road by Cormac McCarthy and The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien while I was through hiking the AT. In both cases, the main characters are taking long journeys by foot, but in both cases, the characters were like more cold and wet and miserable and terrified than I was.
Right.
So that it kind of made me feel a little bit better, like when I was uncomfortable.
Cormac McCarthy and Peter Jennings are probably two of my all-time favorite travel writers, in addition to Tim Cahill. And then the book that really had an impact on me, and I read this after I found The Complete Walker, but which I also loved in terms of a skills book for outdoor travel, but was Colin Fletcher's The Man Who Walked Through Time, which is his story about the first traverse of the Grand Canyon, which just really engaging, and it's given me an appreciation for how wild our landscape is, and what kind of creative things we can do to get off trail and just be explorers. How about movies for you?
I don't have any favorite hiking movies. I kind of got in hot water on this podcast when we were interviewing Chris Mead for saying that I thought backpacking made an unsexy adventure movie. So I'm just gonna stay out of this one.
Yeah, sounds good. I have seen this trend in filmmaking, especially among thru hikers and backpackers who have a passion for photography, for creating these cinematic, gorgeous experiences. And some of them are pretty good, but for me, movie making is always about storytelling. And I personally, I've become more and more drawn lately to people who are just going out there with a GoPro and telling their personal experiences. So my favorite hiking movies are about normal adventures that have been undertaken by people we've never heard of and have no filmmaking experience, but are really good storytellers. And, they're all over YouTube. And so that's kind of where I go to get my hiking movie fix. But a filmmaker that I've known for a long time named Jason Fitzpatrick, who was the director of Mile and a Half, which is a really nice film about the John Muir Trail. He came out with a movie 2 years ago called Unsupported. And it was telling the stories of a couple of people who were doing FKTs. And it was a really incredible film because, number one, most of the footage is shaky, cinematically terrible cell phone and GoPro footage, but the storytelling is so good and it just grips you from start to finish. So that's one I really highly recommend, Unsupported by Jason Fitzpatrick.
I still haven't seen that. I really need to get on that one.
Yeah, I saw it in a theater initially. And again, seeing a cell phone video on a theater is like, it's so counterintuitive to what you want out of a cinematic experience. But I was totally gripped. Loved it.
Well, this is a long episode. We still have some more questions, but maybe we'll bundle them up and answer them in the next couple of podcasts. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Backpacking Light podcast.
The Backpacking Light podcast is supported by backpackinglight.com membership fees.
A backpackinglight.com membership gives you access to nearly 20 years of article archives, community forums, online education, and so much more. You can join our community right now at backpackinglight.com/subscribe. You can download the show notes for this episode at backpackinglight.com/podcast.
And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, especially on iTunes. It helps other people find the show.
Thanks for listening to the Backpacking Light podcast. I'm Andrew Marshall.
And I'm Ryan Jordan. If we can leave you with one parting message, it's this: pack less, be more, because lighter is better. Happy trails, everybody.
So I shoulder my backpack, walk away from the